All right. So it's just me and Jockin today. But hey, uh, we're going to talk about the names of names. And I think this section was really rich. We have all the aspects of the relationships of God's names and how we relate to them. The way I usually start off is there's this one particular line that stood out to me. I'm still trying to think about well, it actually does connect to the name, but so I'll read it off. It was on page 38. It said, a hadith found in Muslim about the day of resurrection, God appears to people in different guises, but they keep on denying him until he presents himself to them according to a mark by which they recognize him. Then he transmutes himself into the form in which they saw him the first time. And I thought that was really a fascinating. I have to look it up actually in the Hadith Muslim, but I don't know if you've read that one, but I have to find it because I feel like I really want to read it from there myself. But if it's true, that's a really fascinating one. And I know that the whole point was to kind of emphasize that the name of like transmutation uh, is something only God has. And I think it even goes back to some of the arguments concerning concerning like Christianity and Islam on the crucifixion, where the Quran says that nobody crucified Jesus, right? It was somebody made to look like Jesus. So the fact that there's this idea of divine deception, of some type of transmutation, that we got fooled as people seeing the crucifixion. But actually, the verses are mainly aimed at the Jews for being proud of themselves for killing Jesus, for like thinking that they've killed Jesus. So I'll pass it on to you, Thomas.
Yeah, just me and you today. So I'll start with kind of following the format. What stood out to me now there was two parts. And it's tied together. It's the names of name, and specifically the expression of they are the robes upon the names. So that's kind of like this clothing, right? That's put on of the meaning, and it's this whole thing about form versus the meaning. And there's a long for my students. I teach typography, which is the visual presentation, the dressing of language in a visual form. So I've used the semantic triangle variation of it, where there's ratio, thing, and name, and then the name is then broken into another subdivision of sound and mark. So typography is a visual representation by marks that represent sounds, and their combination create words which have a meaning because they correspond. It basically, in my mind, was like exactly a parallel to my teaching in typography of this idea of names, that they're the secondary, that they act basically, and that's my next part, which is they act as the bridge of significance, in the sense that traditionally, because you were just bringing up the Christian versus Islamic arguments, probably I think the strongest arguments Christians have is if we acknowledge that God is there's an infinite gap between creation and God. How can we possibly bridge the two together? The answer, to my understanding, talking to Christians, is the Son of God, Jesus, is supposed to be that bridge to unite creation with the Father under their argumentation. What this is presenting is the Islamic argument that no, that the beautiful names of God are the bridge. That is the thing that allows the infinite unknownness, the not he-ness, and the he-ness combined together. You bridge together by this attribute. So, or actually names, that just said in that way. So for me, that's a very rich significance. I agree. These are 6 pages that have an incredible depth to the dynamics. And I think probably again, we talked about this in the very beginning. I think the week 1 group, we all talked about this, that Islam has a very rule orientation, like what school of interpretation, fiqh are you part of? And we all kind of like down on it. We're like, oh, this is a very dead law versus a living law, right? The first introduction of this section talks about No, it is not about the jurisdictions, and it's not following these rules and all that. It puts right to the front. What is this discipline study? It's the beautiful names. That is the instrument of spirituality and devoutness and faith that we have. And this is expressing why that is in all this dimension and qualities. So to summarize one more time, for me was this idea of the names of names as the robes upon the names, and that act as the bridge of the infinite not he with the basically infinite he combined together. So that would be my big takeaway for this week's readings.
So thank you. Yeah, it's funny because it even makes me think about, when we talk about Nietzsche and he says the overman is the bridge. The overman is supposed to be the bridge. I feel like there is room for an Islamic interpretation here to be like, actually, the overman is a man realizing God's divine names. And in that sense, he is serving as a bridge between the phenomenal and the non-phenomenal. And so this is what I really like about just the names in general. But what also hit me is when it says in the section name of names, where it says revelation is an outward form, surah. And to me, that's fascinating. In general, that's fascinating because one, all the Quran's sections, all the Quranic sections are named surahs. So I can interpret this as forms. There's like so many forms in the surah. But what's also illuminating in understanding the Quran in this case is that I forget which section this is, but a hadith or a specific section of the surah doesn't have to explicitly say a name. It is also manifesting a name, which was, to me, that's just fascinating. That's really fascinating because it almost makes me, I've been reading it again, but it makes me want to pay attention so closely into trying to figure out what kind of name is this when I'm reading a specific section. What kind of name is this? And the same thing with like the hadiths. What kind of name is this trying to point towards? Because obviously from the beginning they said there's the 99 names. There's the names that we know, and it acknowledges the names that we know from the revelations of the Quran. But then there's just the names that are sort of not mentioned. And this has to do with the fact that, and this is also in the first section, where the breath of God is this is what I liked. He used all merciful as a name, but the form is the breath, if I understood that correctly. The form is the breath, and so this is what creates everything into existence. This is what brings everything into existence. But it also brings in various names that, oh man, I wish now I could see if I could find on the section here, because I know it's in the first. Okay, here it is. It says, the All-Merciful is called by the name's form. This is because the breath is ascribed to the All-Merciful, and through the breath, the divine words become manifest within various levels of the void, which is where the cosmos becomes manifest. So we call only upon God by means of the form of the name. Every name has two forms. One form is with us in our breaths, and in the letters we combine. These are the names by which we call upon him. They are the names of divine names, and are like robes upon the names. I feel like I still haven't found the one that I'm looking for. Oh, it's a little bit further down. I'm sorry. So a little further down it says, therefore to him, the All-Merciful, belongs to the most beautiful names. But the spirits of those forms which belong to the name Allah are outside of the control of the breath, not being described by any quality. So these spirits, in relation to the forms of the names within the breath, of the All-Merciful are like meanings in relations to words. So I don't know if I understood correctly, but if there's meanings being dispersed from the breath, it's implying that there's particular names not known via the revelation, but that are sort of like are there, and we can either find these in the cosmos or what, like the passage has said, specific surahs and hadiths of from the Sunnah and all that other stuff. And to me, I really found that interesting, because I kept thinking I have to see the specific name, but now Ibn Arabi is saying you need to trace the name, which I think is a concept that, and this is what calls the root, right? Going back to the root. So, all right, I'll pass it on.
Yeah, kind of piggyback what's being said here. I think the first part, I'm reminded instantly of our conversation last week, that really rich conversation about law and decree, and specifically Shaitan's comment about basically implicit and explicit. There's a very big difference of not everything's going to be said. If you're actually, again, in intimate relationships, if you have an intimate relationship, not everything is meant to be said out loud explicitly. A lot has to be read and said, communicated, and understood implicitly, which is, as we said, kind of ultimately the kind of route we want to go to is the laws and principles become internalized. They become harmonized within the self, and we have a kind of love and intimacy with it. And as Davud said, and I think Jeannie amazingly well at the end of the conversation last week, it's an invitation to play, to imagine, right? And specifically the icons, in the sense of these are representations of things that call to forth imagination. You can think through with that. So I'm just tying that into what you're talking about here, which is the relationship of these meanings and forms, and how there are the explicit expressions of the names, but there's also, it's actually, I'll acknowledge that while we know there's an explicitly known 99, that is not the totality. And that's that only the men of faith in the stage, right, in different stations will understand the other meanings, the implicit names, and see their relationships. Which, by the way, is probably one of your major takeaways, is that, like we said before, these names are not just individuated things, right? They're not just like this, bop, and dead. They're in movement. They're in relation to each other. There's actually a very systematic relationship of the different names, by the way. And actually, a lot of the text goes over that this week. And also, I know from reading, Ghazali's reading books on the names, he talks about this. So, for example, and there's different hierarchies of them. So, certain ones, like basically God's relationship to creation, is three names for, has three names for that, for example. Other ones, for example, the relationship of the rich to the king. They are direct. There's like one's a subsection of the other. So, the rich is one that lacks nothing. The king is one who lacks nothing and gives support to others. So they have compounded meanings to them. These are all these are in web relationships. In fact, the whole conversation about why is God not poverty is exactly the point of that. It's pointing out these have very bounded rules within this context. So in fact, actually why these things matter, saying Isa versus Jesus actually has a different meaning, because that one points to a web of relationships of Isa, the son of Miriam, for example, versus Jesus, son of God, as an example. Those have completely different webs of meaning, even though they're referring to the same person. So for me, this is what ultimately comes down to, is these kind of substantial relations. That is actually, it's funny, that's what Aquinas actually says. What God is ultimately is a substantial relations. He makes this argument for the personhoods of God. But anyways, as I said, that stuck in my mind when I was reading this. The set, what you just said too, kind of mine together. Trying trying to think any other particular notes. Yeah, and that's the thing, is that there's just the relations, right? Because also, by the way, the idea is like, the whole point is like, well, wait a minute, if all these divine names are here, how are you not going to, it's not polytheism. How are you not saying they all, each one's on the individual God? I mean, this is very annoying because there's a basic distinction in created and uncreated, basically. And also the idea, also just on a rational point of, we don't even have to go into theology about this, is to say, you're Javier, I'm Thomas. You're listening, I'm speaking. Like, there's different, like, are you different as a speaker versus a listener? No, you're both. They point to one person, right? Based on your activity. So I find this is a very easy argument to blow away, I think, very quickly. Now, there is a really interesting point, just as a side note. I'm a super nerd for nominalism against universals. So this is one of my things. I have a pet topic I love talking about, because I think so much of philosophy basically hinges on this question, but it's somewhat been resolved. People think it's been resolved, but I don't think it has been. Is the example, like, in this way, basically, God is the fundamentum. Like, basically, it's everywhere. This is why God's everywhere, because everything's a relation, like, basically, and God is the foundation measure for all of it. And this text basically goes over explaining those points. Like, for example, in nominalism, the argument is like, where's fatherhood? For example, the argument usually made is is an independent entity called fatherhood, and the answer usually in nominalism is saying no. There's only a man who has a relationship to his child. That's a father. That's the only that exists are these entities. Basically, the property of fatherhood is just a property. It's an attribute that is in. So it's interesting that's made here, but these relationships are only held together by God. And that's basically the way I interpret this text too, making that claim. So yes, and that's kind of the closing note, is this idea of the breath of God with all merciful and all the other properties. There's like ways of reading this, that there's a kind of it's the thing that connects these different names, not to just be isolated things. You can't just see the name by itself. It has to be put in relation to the other names, either as similes in terms of they have either a difference of degree or magnitude, or they have a relationship to each other, and then versus an opposite dialectical opposition, right? So, the beautiful versus the magnificent, for example, and their meanings. That's all for me. I yield.
What I like is, like, you made a good point. There's Isaiah, and then there's, like, you said Isa, right? Isa, and then there's Jesus, Son of God. Here, I think this passage actually, what is fascinating about this passage is that it says every name has two forms. The names that we call upon him by, and then there's God as speaker, by which he calls himself. The names that he calls himself. But the reason why there's names of names is because when we start shoving the names through languages, through all the diversity of languages, Isa is, from my understanding, is the Arabic word for Jesus, right? But it's still vastly different, though. It's the same, but it's still different. And philosophically, I thought this was fascinating, because the names themselves are distinguished by their qualities. And this is how you can make sense of difference. How you can have sameness and difference. Actually, within every name, and this is the fascinating part, within every name, there's sameness and difference, because the names themselves contain all the names, because they contain the essence of God as essence, but they carry the particular quality in order to distinguish themselves from every other name. And I again, this was, if people ever thought, well, how is this any different from panpsychism? Well, there's a lot different. There's a lot different here. And we can use God and the divine names to make sense of plurality, difference, and also on top of this, there's this aspect of subjectivity, where the qualities of every existent thing, we create effects. and also we receive the effects. And I thought this, but again, this is all rooted back to the divine names. Like, and they give a couple examples, right? Like, there was some stuff that I thought would be like sort of more emotional, but I guess qualities, maybe you could lump qualities as, psychic and physical stuff, because one was like gain, loss, hate, love. Then there's distance, attraction. So there's, I guess you could say these are like better used as properties mixed with, I mean, I don't know. I thought it was interesting to look at what exactly his definition of quality is. And of course it does kind of get confusing because it does say, well, there's aspects where it's a property of an effect. And then there's the quality. But I also feel like quality is not really defined. All I know is it's not quantitative. But, as I've been reading from other works, quantity and quality are not so easy to distinguish. We start getting into the roots of it. But I yield.
Fun times. Yeah. And by the way, I mean, Isa or Jesus, right? Another example, we don't have to go down him in that route, is H2O and water mean the same thing. They point to the same thing. That's actually, let me put it this way. Actually, they mean different things because they're drawing up different contexts, right? So one, H2O, hydrogen 2 peroxide. It's fun because, by the way, like that's a quantity, right? They're counting. But as it's one of my favorite pet topics. I talk to Daniel about this all the time. It's not just 2 hydrogen and two hydrogens and 1 water. It's also oxygen. It's also a relationship in the sense that there's actually there's a specific basically angular relationship between the 2 hydrogen and the oxygen. They don't just randomly connect. They have to connect at very specific regions in relationship with each other. I think it's 180. I think 120 degrees, something like that. So basically causes basically a hexagonal relationship between different water molecules connect, which results in the properties of water. So actually this connects to exactly what you just said about properties and attributes. They result from the form of water. So the form of water is not just its material quantity, it's those relationships. This is actually why from Aristotle on, the argument's always been made. Matter is never isolated by itself. It's always arranged in form. Form always exists with matter because the properties of water, the way it boils, for example, it basically goes, even climbing up like that, I forgot what's it called, but basically if you put a piece of paper like on water, the water molecules actually climb up. For example, that's a property of liquids, how they operate, the boiling rate of water, the fact that they freeze at certain temperatures and create crystals and how snowflakes get made from water. All these properties and attributes of the water are coming from its form. It's not just the material object of the hydrogen and the oxygen together by themselves. So all this discussion, and that's the thing too, notice in this domain of chemistry, we can then have a whole discussion of understanding that's different in its dimension than, or station, you can think of it that way, versus just saying water as a common term. So that came to my mind instantly, just talking it through with you. And yes, this idea that one is basically essence and the difference. Yeah, that's the idea, which also remind me a lot of the discussions about virtue itself from, I think, Protagoras in Plato, remember correctly. Meno talks about it too, but it's more teaching virtue as opposed to what virtue is. But reminded that too, that basic question. And actually there's a fun statement in there in Protagoras because Socrates as the character says, oh, is virtue like a face where you need all the components of together to make it? If you don't have it, all the components, you don't have the virtue at all. I just had a meditation on that compared to what we're saying here, is that in any instance of a divine name showing up, all the divine names appear because God's there, basically. So that's another way of saying the divine presence. So when we see the mercy, when we see the wrath, when we see the judgment, when we see the power, the richness, or just the absence, right? These absence properties. I think you're right to say the names that we call God and we call him by, and the names he calls himself. It's a good distinction because a lot of these are about our relation to God. And we use the names as a tool, instrument to help us orient our relationship to God, for example. I mean, some of them are actually defined by actually the absence. So, for example, when we say God is the holy, we mean the one who lacks nothing. He lacks he lacks any impurities of any kind. So it's a relation in that sense. And specifically a kind of absence, lack mode, how we're talking about understanding God. Last note is very much like, I think fundamentally all these names are actually pointing or kind of putting a little spike in our attempts to try to rationally divide the subjective and objective. Like we talked off the record that basically one of my missions in life is to like fight against psychism in terms of just subjectivity, just collapsing all of reality down to just subjective preferences and perspectives. I want to emphasize the ontological realities of existence as much as possible. But what these names are pointing out is that that's not a very clean move, that you can always just put a line in the sand, that there's this side subjective, this side subjective. No, there's very much relationship. So for example, we even know this from the very beginning in the sense that activities. So for example, the burn requires something to be burned as well. So we have to have a passion and an action. So something has to suffer a passion, in this case being burned, and something has to activate the burn, basically a flame, for example. That'd be just one example. So that's the thing, is like this in that activity, there's a recipient. So this idea of taking activities and receiving activities, it's very much tied into the nature of our existence and how we see reality. So I see very much that. And that's kind of the point too, is that basically we're kind of these receptacles that get acted upon with and that's the thing too. Even we talked off the record about prayer, right? So we're saying that who's this prayer for? It's actually for us, because we actually are in a relationship where we need to pray. God doesn't need our prayers. We do. We need the prayer, even though it's towards God. That's kind of the whole point here, or the whole, I think, understanding what's being said here. And with that, I yield.
I thought your water example was brilliant because it actually fed into this really crucial distinction made between how we can look at something and dissect all its relationships instantly and how complex it really is. For example, we take water, right? We can look at water as an object of knowledge. So we divide it as hydrogen and oxygen, right? It's becomes a part of object of knowledge for chemistry. But then there's the object of relationship to power, the fact that it takes energy to pull these molecules together. So it instantly, before we know it, before we even realize, there's all these multiplicity of relationships contained within the very aspect of us just even discussing water molecules, water and hydrogen molecules, right? And I thought, it makes things really complex, because if we take the 99 names seriously, even panpsychism can't escape the fact, like, if we just say, it's funny because people talk about reality, right? We name it. We're already having a relationship with reality. Whatever you want to call it, whatever you want to describe it as, you're still having a relationship with reality. And what I really like about the 99 names is that there's a name for God that's called the reality, the truth. And so no matter what we want to call it, we can't escape the fact that we're always having a relationship towards a truth, towards a reality, whatever you want to call it. So there is this, I feel like there is, it gets, there is this objective, subjective thing going on, but it cannot be purely subjective because in the midst of all the relationships, there is still, if you think about what is reality by itself, that's when you can do like this negative inverse relationship of subjective because everybody has different names. but we're all calling it reality. And to put another further example is that nobody can know every single aspect of me. People have experiences of me as a brother. People have experiences of me as a cousin. People have experiences of me as a friend, as a stranger, there's so many names you could put me as, and it's still not going to fulfill all the aspects that people experience from me. It's just never going to, me as a customer, me as a buyer, me as I think the subjective aspect is such a perfect example of how you can't even fulfill that totality. Like nobody can really know you as a person ever. They only have a specific relationship to you most of the time. If I'm in your classroom, it's just you and me as, I'm student, you're my teacher. That's it. Until maybe we get out of the classroom, then it's like me and you as friends, But if I wanted to be more complicated, I could be like, well, actually, it's not just you and me as student teacher. There's this idea of I'm using you as an object of knowledge. And then there's you as an object of power because I submitted myself as a student. And then there's this relationship of desire and because I want to know, right? Attraction and pull. And so there's these multiplicity of relationships in every single moment. And we don't even realize it. So with that, I'll stop there.
Like I said, 6 pages, a huge amount of depth. I think actually now what we're talking about is the cornerstone of this topic's about is the kind of magnitude of our ignorance, right? In the sense that this act of the name, in one sense, seems to give you might give some people the impression like you can comprehend it. This is the knowledge of possession kind of relationship we've been talking about for weeks, versus knowledge, basically the knowledge of witnessing. So taking the name to witness it. When you take this to witness, you kind of realize the multitudes of the dimensions and crystal, almost like kaleidoscoping property of what's going on here. Now, the only thing I would just say, I think your example is totally accurate, right? In terms of all these dimensions you're talking about, is that, remember, the idea is that there's a relationship, but also a virtue with being, also implicitly in these texts too. So basically, the more virtuous we are, the more being we have, which has more existence, right? So we end up actually being more indefinite, less defined, the less virtuous we are. I just bring that up because what ends up instead is you're just a bundle of properties. Like actually, I think kind of tying to ultimately with intimacy and relationship. Intimacy is that power, that relation where you're not. It's actually, you go beyond just the surface relationships. You pierce to the inner substance. So this is actually the distinction of, there's a reason why there's 99 names and then there's Allah, right? There's a reason why that Allah is one of the names, is because it's the ultimate one. And actually, it's definitely is the name of the greatest depth to understand, versus the more surface names that are a little bit more easier to probably comprehend and have a deeper understanding and intimacy with. Because as you said, the example of knowing me or you, Javier Thomas, right, as a professor, as a student, as a lover, as a friend, as a parent, those are only dimensions of us, not the totality. Intimacy, real intimacy, is knowing a man as their whole. I would argue the only way you actually know that is with a long duration of witnessing that person and knowing the story. And usually a moment of tribulation where we find out that basically that when does their character show through? That's the only time we actually really understand a man or a person, is when those moments appear and we encounter with it. And prior to that, it's only just surfaces and in relations of a certain domain only. So we can only get a surface relationship versus a more intimate relationship. I think that's probably the biggest takeaway, I would say, just from this discussion. So it's both very empowering, but also very humbling. You kind of realize, a very almost like I said, a kaleidoscoping sense of like this, not despair. I don't know that. A sense of like awe of the depth of reality And now, how us little humans, with our attempts to have knowledge, how pitiful we seem to be in that case when we acknowledge that. Because we just said, like, I appreciate you kind of picking up on this water example. Look at that simple thing we take for granted, water. We went over just like a crazy amount of relations just from, and dimensions and qualities about it, just from just breaking up. But wait a minute, it's not just as two objects and one object put together. It's all these other things too. And actually, let's describe that way better, because there has to be reasons why it's something way more emergent than just it's a substantial form, right? It's something more than just the parts. It's something way more than that. So I close from there.
Yeah, I do agree. We should remind the fact that not only it's about realizing the names, but the names themselves have attributes that the person must realize themselves: becoming merciful, becoming forgiving, becoming embodying truth. I don't want to say becoming truth, but embodying truth. And the real question is, how does one embody truth? And I think there is, there's hints here, and it's that you already in some sense have a link to embodying truth, because everywhere is the face of God. And what's fascinating is that when this section really went down to like the fibers of everything, the roots of everything, it's actually almost very difficult for me not to see everything as the face of God now, because theoretically, because everything has a relationship. I lift this cup, it's a relationship to power, which roots back to the name, the bigger name, power. I want to drink water, desire, truth, love, attraction, all this stuff. I'm constantly having a relationship with God. And that would mean, which was one of my favorite quotes in there, is that relationships are neither entities or things, right? Which you had discussed. But is that these non-entities, these relationships, are within the entity itself. And to go back to the Quranic verse that is very famous, when God says, I am closer to you than your own jugular vein. Beautiful. Beautiful. Beautiful way of explaining it without actually saying, I'm going to explain this verse. Beautiful way of explaining it without having to go to that way. And not only that, is that it's really, for me, it was a really self-reflective text, because one, it means that actually when I'm having a relationship with any human being, anything, it's almost like I'm not really having a relationship with you. I'm having a relationship with all the multiplicity of qualities that root from what? Root from God's names. And that means I'm only ever having a relationship to God. That's it. There is nothing else. There is nothing else. And it's funny, because when you fail at this is because when the relationships themselves turn empty and you feel unsatisfied, is because you are directing at something that actually doesn't exist. And that was because, remember, it's like when someone's like, oh, well, her and I are in a relationship. It's neither an entity nor a thing. And yet it's funny in the cultural context, because people say, well, we're a thing, we're her and I, we're a thing, we're a concrete thing. But actually, all this love, this yearning, this power, this attraction, this repulsion, all back to names. That's the only relationship that you're actually having, ironically enough. I would even dare to say that the times that there's nothing is actually you're having relationships with the wrath, you're having a relationship with the void. You're having a relationship with all these other. And I thought it was such a meditative just thing to think about in terms of personal relationships, interactions with people. Really taking seriously the aspect of everywhere I turn is the face of God. The real question is, which face do I want to see Right? And with that, I'll pass it on.
I mean, Ramadan's coming up, and I think actually we were talking off the record about fasting. And ultimately, the purpose of fasting is to realize the subsistence of God, right? That everything's on this bedrock of God. And this when we fast, the pain we feel when we're hungry and thirsty is meant to signify our dependence on God, right? In this relationship. So as you're saying, like I think very, very poetically and very, very, very powerfully, ultimately, every moment of existence is a relationship to God. And our relationship to our fellow human beings, other human beings, when they're in falsehood, basically pointed to nothingness, right? As you're pointing out, they're lacking because of that. They have us inherently a kind of negative lack because of that. And it is, I'm also reminded of the Christian story about I think it was the wives, basically, the women going to Jesus was telling this parable of in the middle of the night, they had to go to a cabin and people answered only a certain percentage not answered the door. There was knock on the door and let them in. I think another certain group did not answer the call until later. And when Jesus answers the door and says, I do not know you. Who are you? Basically, it's like kind of like you've forgotten who I am and the relationship you're supposed to have with me. I think in your note, by the way, of the embodiment of truth, I think first of all, on two notes. One is I've said this many times. I remember one time in a group discussion, I said I kind of like just kind of threw it out there. The whole group kind of had a shock of realization about it. The idea, why is it more choice worthy to prefer the truth than the false? That's actually a moral claim that we should choose the truth over the false. Why? Well, because why should we love the truth? Why should we choose it over falsehood, over non? Because it's something embedded in us to tell us that we need to do this. We're compelled almost to have to answer yes to that. Because who would rationally make the argument? No, we should choose the false. Ultimately, like we can't help ourselves. We're forced to compel to say yes. We have to have this love for the truth, and ultimately, martyrdom is the confronting of a moment where you have to choose the truth over the falsehood, ultimately. And those are the moments of heroism and embodiment of the truth. And I would make that argument. So I kind of wrote that note down as you were saying it right there. And I think that, that the whole question ultimately of our relationship to, I also remember another note from the Christians. It was this conversation of whenever two or three of you gather together, you'll find me. I think that's one little, not wrinkle in there in your statement, but I think it's an important aspect about it. There's something about discourse. Like I make that argument. That's what I would take it as. Something about discourse of fellow rational human beings that reveals the divine names and reveals virtue and reveals knowledge and reveals all these powers. It's only in that's almost, I always bring it up to say, like, kind of the one could make the argument is you could fall down a solipsistic argument. Well, there is only me and my relationship to God. That's it. Everything else is just an illusion. I want to just posit that one counter argument from the Christians to point out. I think that's an interesting kind of power angle, another angle to say, no, let's not fall down a solipsistic spiral that only exists as me and God. That's it. Everything else is nothing. But I do agree. It's an interesting point, especially the idea of which face of God you want to see. That's absolutely true. In fact, one of my spouse, I say point blank, one of the most important signs, how we say, like, there's basically obesity in the body versus fitness of the body. There's also spiritually obesity in fitness. And it's in the sense of gratitude and appreciation versus entitlement and complaining, right? That's almost like, how, you might have a beautiful body, you might be incredibly obese and ugly spiritually because you're ungrateful, you're spiteful, you're full of vengeance, you're petty, you have all this smallness, right? Versus elderly, old people that are not pretty because they're older, they're not fit, have a glowing soul. In fact, beauty, I think in previous week they said this, real beauty is in a beautiful soul. It's a kind of radiance because they have this kind of fitness of the soul, of the spirit, because they have this sense usually of gratitude and mercy and thought. They embody all the beautiful names. instead. And with that, I yield.
I think I'll clarify my position on the relationship, but I think it's because you're right. It can be confused with like solipsism. But what's fascinating is that I feel like this passage makes a very interesting argument for there's creatures, there's things, there's real concrete things, but the actual only real relationship is the one with God, because the relationship itself is the intermediary. It's the bridge. The names of the bridge between how I get to know you as a person. Every time we speak, every time we have a discourse, the name is the bridge from which I understand or begin to know myself, and I begin to know God. And I think, you know, because again, like you made a very good, careful distinction there. But like, look, we have to be very careful, because you know people be like, all right, solipsism it is, baby, you know. And you're right. I don't want that. I don't want that at all. Because for some reason, you know, it's funny because most of the time when I talk about these things, I'm like, I still believe in the concrete, you know, I still believe in the concrete in people, but I forget sometimes that there's people that will listen to me and be like, okay, okay, you know, and I forget that. So, you know, thank you. I also wanted to bring up, there is this aspect of, okay, the name. Oh, someone came in. So the name denotes reality. Jyoti.
Hey, did we start a little early? Because there are.
Oh, that's right. Oh my gosh, yeah. I did, because we had daylight
Time
savings
zones.
time.
We're in the United States. We have our time zone changed.
Yes, our
No,
time
no,
zone
that I
changed.
understand. But as per IST, it is 6:40 in the morning. It has
It's
always been. It has always been like that. Did you shift the time in the standard email also?
no, I didn't put the time. I didn't
But
put
have you
I,
been
well,
live for past 50 minutes?
yeah, I know.
How did that happen? Because Chetan is also up, you know.
Okay.
So
That explains a lot. We were wondering why it was only me and Javier on the call. We were like, I guess no one else is gonna make it, so we just.
Yeah,
No.
it's because the daylight savings time, I think, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
because it pushes the time. We went forward an hour.
Yeah, forward an hour, literally.
Yeah,
So
forward an
basically,
hour.
yeah, for Jyoti and Shaitan, probably they think it's normal time.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry. I should have. I totally forgot about that. I apologize, Jyoti.
yeah, I thought I'm a little early, but okay.
No.
Also,
You actually came in on time. It's
yeah,
actually really,
yeah.
really
Also,
nice.
you know, it's early
Javier came an
morning
hour early.
here, so I had to like wake up really early and get ready. I'll just call Chetan also so that he can also join. He's also up and was just waiting for time, I think.
Oh my
Okay.
God,
Just give
what
me
a
one.
divine comedy this is.
But I guess I'll continue with the denoting the reality. Is the what? Okay, yeah. I want to talk to you about this, because the reality, it says it doesn't change. The reality doesn't change. It's constant. What do you? I mean, I accept it. I mean, I can grapple with it, but it's like, and I think this is why he talked about the transmutation aspect, because I think I was still trying to understand, well, how do we make sense of change then? Is change a relationship to God and not actually, you know, the appearance themselves? So that's what I was thinking. But you know, Jyoti, if you already called Jitan, then I want to let you speak.
He's actually waiting to get an entry.
Oh, I thought, okay, I'll send the link again.
Can you see him in some waiting list or something?
There you go.
Yeah. This is some international screw up.
Yeah. America wants to do daylight savings time.
Chetan, you have to unmute.
Hi everyone.
Hi,
Have you
Titan.
time table? The time change in the US is that okay?
That's
I know
exactly
it's
what
How
happened.
I see the meeting going on 50 minutes. I didn't realize that. Only 6:13 over in India.
and I totally forgot too, because me and Thomas were like, well, I guess it's just gonna be us. And then I
Yeah,
put daylight saving time.
we are not used to different time zones over here. Actually, we are just have a single time zone, so we do not normally check for
So,
changing it.
so I guess the way we'll continue with this is that I think Thomas, you want to kind of give a summary of what you've been saying?
I was just gonna say we're gonna have to basically restart. We're going to restart. We'll do a summary of what Javi and me said, and then we'll just circle. We'll continue the cycle again.
So sorry, guys.
No, it's not your guys' fault at all. It's our fault. We just
Yeah.
blanked
It's
on that
really-
it was daylight savings time.
It's really my fault for that. I apologize.
But
It's
how do we
fine.
avoid this in future? I'm just concerned. I'm sorry. I know we are live.
We should know at what dates time zones change in US. Basically, we don't know that.
Oh
no?
dear.
Yeah.
Hey, the good news is apparently our government has decided to remove daylight saving times going forward. So now we're now permanent one time zone going forward now.
Okay.
So I mean, I'll volunteer to basically restate the original. The good news is actually most of our time this hour we've been just circling on the same major idea. So in one sense, this is actually very good. Worked out that way. The major point was, at least from my takeaway from this week's reading, was this idea of the names of names as the bridge between the divine infinite, right, and creation. That was super interesting because the expression was used in the text of the robes underneath upon the names. So the names are given a piece of or robed in a clothing that is an appearance that we need as a way of a bridge of understanding to come to God. There was a fun note I talked about how in my typography class, I used actually a very similar metaphor or a model to explain typography, because typography is a visual representation of words, right, in composition. So words are a relationship to things and have a meaning. So that's kind of a semantic triangle. But the words themselves visually have a relationship between sounds and marks. So that's my thinking of a kind of secondary property of the name. We went down basically a whole rabbit foot, but the major kind of follow through of that was that names have a built up relation to each other, and they have a web of relationships. So, for example, Isaac versus Jesus, those are very distinct. They reference the same thing, but they point to completely different webs of meaning, of understanding. And then I use another example of using H2O versus water. They signify the same thing, but they actually are completely different domains. When we say H2O, we've entered not just or basic quantity of 2 of this and 1 of that. It's also specifically there's a form, in the sense there's a relationship. The hydrogen and oxygen don't just randomly assemble in any order. There's actually very specific positions, angular degrees in which they fit. And that leads to all these powers and attributes to water, boiling at certain temperatures, freezing at certain temperatures, having certain freezing and creating snowflakes at certain properties and how they aggregate together, et cetera, et cetera. So these names are not just dead things. They're actually not just the explicit names themselves. There's also these implicit significations that we kind of tie into last week's great discussion. Real intimacy is not just knowing things explicitly. You get demand to be told everything explicitly with your to know something intimately is unreasonable. That doesn't make any sense. There's an implicit understanding. So our understanding of the surah, the names and the meaning and their forms, is an implicit relationship to gaining intimacy. That's basically the follow through for what we were just talking about, and we were just expressing that in different dimensions and ways. That's all for me.
And then for me, I was picking up of Thomas' example, how easily something, an object, gets complex with the relationships of the names, and I played off the H2O thing, where it's like, we can look at H2O as an object of knowledge, which would go root back to the name of knowing, and then there's the relationship of H2O to power, which would relate to the bigger name of power, and then to attraction and to repulsion, and the fact that it takes energy to keep these two molecules together. And instantly, when we start thinking in this way, we understand that there's a complexity and multitude of relationships within one single object that we can relate to. And also, what I found fascinating is that the definition of relationship was that a relationship is neither entity or a thing. And I kind of did like a little funny example about how, when people say that they like each other, they say, oh, well, we're a thing. We're a thing. But actually, what's funny about this is that your relationship is not actually to the creature. It's always the relationship of the qualities. Oh, I love him. I love her. She is so kind. She is so merciful. It's all these qualities that we actually have relationships, but they are just names of names. And that actually the real relationship, you could say, is the divine name. So it's God in itself, the essence. But Thomas kind of made a very careful distinction for me. He's like, we have to be careful not to make this like a panpsychism or a solipsism, that every week, is just, that's it. But in some sense, I was just trying to say that there's concrete things, but actually our soul relationship, the relationship itself, is actually, from this passage, you could say that the only real relationship you have is actually between you and God. And it's through all the creatures, through the qualities of the names. You being kind to somebody else, someone being merciful, someone being wrathful, someone using power against you. This is all relationships to names. And I found that actually very fascinating to think about in this way. And it caused a lot of, self-reflection because, when I brought up like a personal example, like, when you fall in love with somebody and you realize how all of a sudden it just turns empty, like all of a sudden something happens, it changes, and you're like, what's going on? And you could say from this passage, you're actually experiencing a new face of God. Or when you don't consciously aim towards that, then you realize that the relationship itself is not a thing. It's actually not a thing. It's a relationship is a non-existent quality, but it's a non-entity within the entity. And that was something that was very fascinating for me. And so with that, I kind of summarized my fascinations. Jyoti,
I disturb you for a minute. I will log out and log in again. Just give me access. Yes, give me a minute.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Javier. Thanks, Thomas. That was really something. I had a tough time reading these 6 pages. I read it and I couldn't wrap my head around it. Then I read it again, then again. And I realized maybe because I have not been exposed to any theological text, and I thought maybe I need to read Quran or something to really understand what is happening here. So this was tough, but when it started making sense, it was like amazing. I really don't think I have really made sense out of it. Going from what you were saying, Javier, that the real relationship is between you and God. And what personally struck me in these pages, he is talking about that names are not creatures. And they are also the mediator between God and cosmos. And there are no creatures also. If you really look at that, and the way I was trying to understand it, it seems that human beings are somewhere in the mediatory zone. Because if we look at the names and the relationships also, those names are actually the relationship that God has with the cosmos. And when those relationships are between God and cosmos, and then we are talking about names in terms of essence as well as in terms of quality, then it seems that the way we can associate with cosmos is through these relationships, which we understand it in terms of different kinds of names. but we are also somewhere, so there is a ephemeral nature to us. There is a, we somewhere I realize that human beings are this mediatory aspect between God and cosmos, and where it depends on these relationships that you have and how these names talk to you. Because he also goes on to say that these names are something that that is conveyed and is demanded of. So there are two things. What is it that one is trying to convey, and what is demanded out of it? So how do they speak to you? And then they become a way through which you can have a relationship with cosmos. So if you look at page 37, and again the knowledge and the power thing that you were talking about, and somewhere in the middle, every divine reality has has a property within the cosmos that doesn't belong to any other. These realities are relationships. The knowing has a relationship to the reality of knowledge different from the relationship to the reality of power. Somewhere knowing something is like knowing God, and knowing something is also about you knowing it. So you have a relationship with knowing that particular object also. And he's also very, he's bringing a nuance of, by also bringing a nuance between reality of knowledge and reality of power, which to me was a kind of a cautionary note, because knowing is related only to the object of knowledge. And why I'm saying a cautionary note, because in this scientific technical world we have a very artificial relationship with object, with relationship with people, with them. For us knowledge means power, and so we want to know, to name it, to control it. But here we are talking about knowing something, naming something, controlling something through a specific relationship which is percolating over here, which is different from the one that we can see in power when we are entering into that domain. I also want to speak little about this duality, that the two denotations of the name, and where this multiple thing is coming out. You know that how um, this aspect of being a life giver and a slayer, being exalter and abaser also. So how we have these, there are these two qualities that are going together, the divine essence also and quality. And this is something that I think in Thomas' example comes out very clearly. We need these qualities so for any kind of distinction. But more than that, everything is also related to God. And then if you look at this example where he's saying, how strange, where will who is sitting with him be mustered? And how did the journey from realizing this overbearing to all merciful? So when you, where there's this quote of on page 37 of Abu Yazid, on the day when we shall muster the God-fearing to the all merciful in droves. The realization that when you are sitting with the God-fearing, and when you make a movement from being God-fearing to all merciful, these two things go, there is a realization that you get of both the things. You are close to the God-fearing thing also, and also to all merciful. Sorry, I was like very inarticulate, but yeah.
I thought you did good. I thought you did good, Jyoti. I think that was a really good summary, actually. Chitan?
Yeah, I actually do not have as much to say in that today as I usually do. But one thing actually, we can start with this problem of relationships, and we know that that relationships in general always function in the human world, if say Lacan understands it, because there's an underlying non-relation built into it. you know uh, so for instance, if you start thinking about that, is there an ideal relationship possible between you and the next person? And Lacan's answer would be, there is no ideal relationship possible, and that is not a bad thing, because that is what allows the diversity of relationships to exist. And he calls this point of non-relation, in some senses. But if you read a text like this, uh, it is circumventing that problem in a different way. Essentially, what is the problem that Lacan is trying to answer? Lacan is trying to answer the problem that how do you place relationships in a dimension where its diversity can be completely affirmed. That's what Lacan's problem is, because if you have a singular way of associating with one thing with the other, then all other ways become meaningless. That's the underlying question, isn't it? That how do you affirm each way of relating one thing to the other as something which is important and necessary to that object itself. And minute and I started thinking about writings like these where you are trying to think through that problem. And if you look at the question of names, for instance, and you start thinking about um, you know uh, the two ways of thinking, that one is in the God's eyes all these names are one, and then these multiplicities exist for each one of those perspectives from which you start looking at them. And you realize that what is happening actually is that a writing like this is completely trying to remove all the anxieties that exist in philosophy. In philosophy, there's a lot of anxiety about philosophical positions you're taking. You know, there is a sense of saying that this is my position, this is how I orient myself, and then you fight over those positions, or you at least enter into some kind of a relationship of uh, conflict with other positions in some senses. That's the nature of philosophical thinking, at least at its basal level. We may discuss, few philosophers who transcend it or who don't. Those discussions are separate. But if you look at a writing like this writing is actually not entering into that kind of a language game at all. It is doing something different. It is saying that let's see if we can engage with these questions without this anxiety of where we are locating ourselves. And it is giving you one point of reference to which all of you can locate yourself, and that point of reference doesn't need to be in language at all. That is your relationship with God. That is your relationship. That is not something anybody else is worried about. You don't need to define that unity. You don't need to. All you need to do is you need to presuppose that unity, such that everybody can have their own unique relationships. There's the presupposition at work. And if you read the way these paragraphs end, and I think um, that is where he's trying to take us. And it's, in some senses, at least in the philosophical thinking, it's very close to what Wittgenstein would sort of think about. Wittgenstein's problem in philosophy exactly is that not you have to bring something new in this world, but you have to remove the tensions that exist in that knowledge itself. So you already have knowledge when you're engaging with things. And his point is that, we cannot know anything new in this world. I cannot, as a philosopher, come and tell you what you have to do, what you don't have to do. All I can tell you is that there is a way to orient yourself such that the inner tensions of your own engagement with that thing can lessen themselves, or that can reduce themselves. There is a way through which you can affirm your own position vis-a-vis the relationships that you're entering in that sense. If you read the last section, absolutely last, page number 38, how can a human being cease being a human being, or an angel stop being an angel? If this could happen, the realities would be overthrown. God would cease being a god, the real would become the creatures, and the creatures the real. No one could depend upon knowledge, the necessary would become possible, the impossible become necessary. And order would be corrupted. So there is no way in which the realities can be overthrown. It is impossible for the realities to change. So the servant is a servant and the Lord is the Lord. The real is the real and the creature is a creature. There is something about, I don't know if it makes sense or not, but there's something about this way of seeing the world which is extremely, I think important to incorporate in today's time, where we all actually function through our own, in some sense, anxieties vis-a-vis.
That was good. I mean, because it's funny because we raise all these problems, right? But using Ibn Arabi's thinking, it's that it's a problem, but you're already having a relationship to the problem. We already have to presuppose our relationship in order to have a problem. We always have to presuppose It almost reminds me of like one of Rumi's poems, which like any movement or sound is an act of faith. and and it's interesting when we talk about philosophy because there's always specific things that we choose to have anxieties about. And I almost want to be like, this is like the face of God that we choose to see almost. When we raise the issues of philosophy or any issues that we have, is that there's specific relationships that we're trying to understand, I think. And I think, and I guess this way of thinking is what was really fascinating to me, because I feel that you're right. I don't think a lot of us think like this in our current time. And it would be interesting to incorporate this type of thinking of relationships, rather than, because it's funny, right? We the biggest conversation was always the subject and object, as if there was like this gap. But actually, the subject and object, you're always having a relationship. The relationship is the bridge. The name is the bridge, but between you and the object and the subject, and it's actually the quality that is within the entity that we're able to have this relationship at all. And I wish I could expand more on this, Chitan, but I will read one section because I read it to Thomas, and it was this one was the one that fascinated me, and it almost kind of echoes what you're talking about, like with the anxiety. It's on page 38. It says, it's on the right side, I believe. It says, a hadith found in Muslim about the day of resurrection, God appears to people in different guises, but they keep on denying him until he presents himself to them according to a mark by which they recognize him. Then he transmutes himself into the form in which they saw him the first time. I was kind of speechless on that one. I'm not gonna lie. I'm interested to see like what you guys thought about that. This idea of, because I was talking to Thomas about this, is that it says that the names denote reality, and as you read, Chitan, is that the realities don't change. So that means transmutation is, from what I'm concluding, is a name, is a type of name of God. That when we're experiencing change, and whatever relationship I have to change, that is a relationship I have to God's specific name of transmutation. If that's what I'm grasping, because if realities don't change, then I don't comprehend. Then so I'll pass it on.
I mean, to build on what you're saying, Javier, the term, the word metaphor over form. So the idea when we use metaphor, the power of it is the idea is that we can literally transmute meaning of things from one thing to the other. So when we say, I'm trying to think of some example. I'm starting to fade. Unfortunately, we're getting we've been talking already for an hour, but the capacity for metaphor to have any property of truth at all is, first of all, a very ancient tradition. Aristotle very much claimed that metaphor, specifically a kind of proportional analogy form of it, was a mode of saying this is that, right? So it's literally this power of transmutation, but not in the manner. So basically, like, man can't be switched to a horse, for example, but their form can be understood by these kind of relations. So, for example, I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. The idea, for example, we can talk about money, basically cash flow. We use the verbiage flow, treating it as a liquid, but money is not a liquid at all. That's ridiculous. But we have a meaning understanding that's transparent to us because of this power of metaphor. So that'd be the way I would interpret that expression or talking about it. The only way metaphors that are supposedly figurative speech, that are not literally true, but are still true, is because there's a fundamental reality that undergirds it, that supposits and subsists, in though our language can vary wildly and maybe not represent reality. Actually activate the imagination, by the way. So that's what metaphors do. They activate the imagination in this case, which when we're not just, what we're saying here is they're not just these random kind of arbitrary subjective choices. A really powerful metaphor, as a proportional analogy, is pointing to reality. It's connecting by name every existence of reality that was obscured before or not obvious. This is me just picking up what Javier just put up. I hope it's useful. By the way, the presuppositions, this is the general argument for theism, right? To say we have to presuppose a God to make all these claims. By the way, we don't even have to even go that far. I was saying before the Javier, where we're talking about, it was an idea of like embodiment of truth. I said we see all the time by the very fact that we actually make the presumption that the truth, we should prefer the truth from the false. And that's a moral claim that we ought to choose for the truth. We should not choose falseness. And in fact, anyone makes any counterclaim to that, we should choose the false, seems ridiculous. The entire enterprise of discourse, knowledge, all the other things require us to prefer the truth over the false. So I would say that's an example of presuppositions built right into the door, right into the gate. And it's interesting that one of the names of God is the truth. I always find that, I think, a very interesting property right there. And by the way, and Jyoti, on your comment before about man as this kind of bridge in and of itself. Yeah, I remember from a couple weeks ago, the idea of man is basically a little universe, a little cosmos in and of himself. So I think that makes perfect sense right there, what you were saying with that. And exactly this idea, like we were talking to Javier before you guys got on the call, of knowledge. Again, there's a very big difference between knowledge of possession. Knowledge is power, gaining possession of things, versus knowledge is witnessing, a kind of understanding. It's a very different relationship right from the get-go. And by the way, this whole idea of there's a difference between proper noun names and activities as names. So for example, each one of us, as Thomas, at this exact moment in the last couple minutes, has been the speaker. You all have been the listeners. But meanwhile, when you were all speaking, I was a listener. So if we just go by these activity names, it seems arbitrary. It seems like there's a little wacky magic. And we can have a whole litany of attributes given to us in activity names. We can attribute to every single one of us, but then there's a proper noun name that grounds it. That's a thing we could denote and point to that subsists across all those activities. And in the case of the divine names, it's God, Allah. In this case, it's the ultimate one. That is not a surface representation. It's an actual substantial. This is when we say these other names, we also mean this. So, and every time we say one name, we mean ultimately God too at the same time. So I hope this was useful of me picking up what was said, and I'll pass off my baton to Jyoti now.
Yeah, thanks. I think what we need to understand, which I'm trying to, is this contradiction. Reality is frozen. Reality is same. Yet there is a dynamic aspect to it. Also, there is a word that is coming time and again, which is revealed, which makes sense because it is frozen. It is always there. And it's up to the relationships that how it gets revealed to you. So it's not something that you have to invent, create. On the contrary, something that is revealed, which has, I think, other connotations as well. The way I understand transmutation, and I think it's very fascinating where he's talking about, to me also the word then, because I really thought about it, then I went to the footnote, and I will just read what you read again. God appears to people in different guises, but they keep on denying him until he presents himself to them according to a mark by which they recognize him. I did not understand why he used the word then. And I realized that maybe because it's quote, so he's reiterating, and it should mean, in other words, he transmutes himself into the form in which they saw him the first time, which to me was a parallel of the earlier sentence, so that as human beings, we recognize him. We are able to, and that's why God has to transmute and keep on changing and have this dynamism over there. with transmutation and this the two qualities, the essence and the quality bit that we are talking about, to me it resonated with Hegel. And so when Hegel and this is somewhere in sense certainty consciousness chapter only, somewhere on page 62, where there is an entire discussion on here and now. When we are talking about tree, and so I will just read something because I found it always fascinating. This pure immediacy therefore no longer has any concern with the otherness of the hair as a tree which passes over into a hair that is not a tree, or with the otherness of the now as a day which changes into a now that is night, or with another I for which something else is object. Its truth preserves itself as a relation that remains self identical and which makes no distinction of what is essential and what is unessential between the I and the object. So there is a preservation of the hair in the now. So here is the tree, I turn around and there is no tree. But the fact of there not being a tree, uh, the tree has carried over. So in the otherness becomes possible through what it is not. So yes, it is morning because it is not night, but it is also morning because there was a night, and there is a preservation of night in the morning, and there is a preservation of morning in the night. And that's how I was trying to understand transmutation, because when God is appearing in these different kinds of forms which are there, to which it, so it becomes hair for me. But then so that's how we elevate also. But then how do you understand the journey from God fearing to all merciful? How do you understand that journey? To be able to understand that journey, one has to like see God in God fearing also and in all merciful also. How here and now stitched together. Yeah, that's it.
Fascinating, Jyoti. Um, you know, to to come back to, I think, Javier's discussion, of that paragraph, I remember, Rumi's that very famous. There's this famous anecdote or story kind of a thing in Rumi where, and we all have heard it in different forms, where you're blind and you each of us are pulling at one part of the elephant and we're thinking, oh, mine is this is strong, this looks like a tree, this looks like a rope. You're on the tail, or you're on the trunk of the animal, you're on the tuskers, or you're on the legs, and then each of you will look at, uh, uh, see it from what you are feeling at that moment. And that is, I think, what Jyoti's point with uncertainty in Hegel actually was, in some senses. That is what, that immediacy gives to you, and then you have to uh, make it concrete through that movement in Hegel, and so on and so forth. But either way, whatever that thing might be, but we all, it takes a very different kind of an effort to see that we all are touching the elephant itself. That's the that's the underlying problem there, and that I think that problem remains, I think, rooted into this problem, dynamic versus, uh, you know um, frozen, in that sense. That how do we find a way to approach the dynamic such that the multiplicity simply do not, um, you know uh, becomes separate from each other, in that sense. Oh, this has no relationship to other things. This is just, and that is one of the human ways of engaging with the world. It's so violent upon us that, without realizing, at many times, we want to engage with it in a manner in which we do not think it has any bearing on any other things. Let me just manage this, the way I can over here, and then we'll see. Because because the there is a point of switch over there, and I think Javier quoted Rumi the other day, where he said, what is Sufi? It's about somebody else. It's about, being able to laugh in the act of pain, in that sense. And I was thinking, one can even go a step further and ask yourself, and I that isn't this idea of knowledge itself, and we've been discussing names, but isn't this problem of names itself located in completely being open towards somebody else's pain and suffering? There is something about names as such which which can be completely affirmed when you're open to someone else's pain and suffering. It is only through that openness, and this is, I think, I was reading Veena Das's work on anthropology, and she said that my work is simply about standing firm to somebody else's pain and suffering in that sense. And I started thinking that a lot of our questions of naming actually are questions of pain in some senses. These are real questions of points of tensions, point of anxieties that we have with the other. And that is why we do not want to. We have this strange backing away from affirming their names in that sense. And how do we think through that? These kind of ways of thinking. I wanted to get to that paragraph. If I can take 2 minutes more, in which Javier was talking about. So when he says the root of this, he says the power of transmutation, which is transmuted to God in a hadith found in Muslim about a day of resurrection. God appears to people in different guises, but they keep on denying him until he presents himself to them according to mark by which they recognize him. So I think this problem of recognition of God is a problem essentially of that we want God in the way that we find it comfortable to have him in that sense. And that's essentially the underlying tension over there, that there is a self of ours which only recognizes things when it's given to us in the form that we recognize it in. A philosopher would recognize God only in his only when it's written to him as a philosophical treatise. A poet would recognize to him God when it is given to him as a very nice metric poetry, or and you can see it for others, because we all have our own orientations through which we sort of approach the world, which gives us the stability, but that also gives us the contours of our ability to recognize the other. There is that that reality. And what are the modes of activation of your own self, which can actually recognize things, and there's no way to change this, but at least there's a mode of existence in which you can start accepting there are points of recognition in this world which are simply which may be outside the framework of which you're looking at it, and those frameworks need to evolve constantly. It's not a simple question of new information coming to you from the outside, but the framework in which you're processing that information needs to evolve constantly. It cannot be same, it cannot be constant, it cannot be given to you as a simple entity. In what ways does this evolution of the framework itself, what somebody might call like games in that sense, because each framework has its own rules in some senses. What recognition of this information in new frameworks demand you to reorient yourself towards pain and suffering? I think that remains one of the question, because one of the things that keeps your framework constant is your aversion towards pain. And when Rumi says wound is where light enters, he means something very very I think deep in that sense, where that in what ways can we orient ourselves towards completely submit ourselves towards our own suffering in some sense and other people's suffering. um, you know, that becomes
Oh man, that was really good. That was really good, Chitan, because so I was thinking the moment that Jyoti was talking about this, because it hit me now. It hit me now when I started thinking about just the attributes: mercy, wrath, right? If I think about it, actually, the idea of wrath, the reality of wrath, never changes. It never changes. It's always wrath. But when I encounter mercy, I can't be like, oh, something changed. It's actually, I'm encountering a new name. I'm having a relationship with another name, mercy. But mercy never changes in itself. It's always mercy. Now, I think that the tricky part is when someone's pretending to be merciful. That we could be like, oh, we're encountering a different name here, deceitful. they're a liar, the abuser, the abaser, something like that. But I did find that interesting to think about, is that actually, these names, it doesn't change. The reality of wrath is always the same. The reality of mercy is always the same. The reality of attraction is always the same. The reality of repulsion is always the same. And I think, Chetan, the questions that you're raising is that these have to be the same in order for us to have an actual relationship with a human being. I have to be able to have a constant relationship to pain in order to have some type of relationship to what that person is suffering. And the same thing with, like them being upset. Like, I'd be like, okay, yeah, I've had upset before. That doesn't change for me. Like, I understand the reality of being upset. And so that means I can create this open relationship with somebody that is suffering, that is being upset, that's been abused, and feeling sadness. That there has to be some type of constancy in order for a relationship to exist. Now, but the other thing that you were provoking actually is that, if I understood correctly, is that these relationships, even though the realities can be the same, doesn't mean that we stay stuck there. We can transform them. We can transform, for example, I want to talk about like love, for example. Like, I can transform love instead of just like sensual realities, sensual things. And I think Jyoti is like bringing up Hegel here. Instead of just me loving sensual things, I can transform my love into something else, something above the sensual realities. I'm thinking of almost like sublimation here, where you're talking about Freud, you're sublimating the desire. Like, desire is always going to exist, but I can always sublimate my desire. I can always transform my desire. And I think this aspect of sublimating, transforming the desire or the name, or I would say not the name, but the relationship to the name, is, I think, what Chetan was talking about how we can get closer to human beings from their pain and their suffering. Because then it puts the onus back on us to not just be content with one specific relationship that I have. And, just to give like a more personal example, I used to always be like annoyed. I think that's probably the best term. I used to be annoyed that people are not, are not like in these groups that are like curious about the world, that want to ask these questions, like, for example, my mother doesn't care about philosophy. She could care less about philosophy, but it would be a disservice to myself to think that she doesn't care, because one, she just likes to do, I know, because she's a nurse, so she likes to do noble deeds. That's like her thing. She likes to take care of people. She's not interested in the questions, but she likes to take care of people. So it would mean that actually, even though I'm obsessed with knowledge, her path, her mark is the relationship to service, to deeds and stuff. And that in order for me to transform, you could say, to get closer to my mother, is actually to transform to start having a relationship to deeds, to service. Because if not, then I'm never going to understand why does she prefer that over knowledge, or these questions. I'm not going to say knowledge, but over these questions. Why does she prefer that over these questions? So I have to force myself to see a different face. I think that's where I'm heading. I force myself to see a different face. And I think that wonderful example about, like, you're seeing the God-fearing and then you're seeing the merciful. I mean, how else would I be able to distinguish anything if I'm only ever seeing the wrath of God? So, all right, I'll pass it.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm fading over here. So this is probably my last cycle, and now I'm going to have to exit. But just want to just kind of add to the conversation. I think what Shaitan's talking about with the names and knowledge, I have my note here about an idea of recognition. It kind of stuck to my mind. There's a concept in typography and design called legibility. So the marks can be there, right, in terms of basically representing shapes, but if they're not legible, like if the reader cannot see them, then it's like doesn't exist basically. Even though it's right there in front of you, the marks are there, you can't see it. It's not legible. And legibility also requires the other side. So, for example, if you're not familiar with a script system and you see something written or typeset in that script system, you see the marks, but you do not see the sounds. You're not understanding the names presented to you, the words. So it can go both ways. But either the marks are illegible in the sense you cannot recognize them at all, in the sense that you know the sounds, you know the names, but you can't see the marks, or you can see the marks, but you don't have the meanings signified from it. So it can go in both directions. So I'm using this as a metaphor to basically, or analogy to describe illegibility in the sense of you don't know the relationship to the names, you cannot see it. You cannot see God's mercy, God's judgment, right? Unless you have a conception of it in the first place. The other side is you may not, as you're experiencing it, you may not have the comprehensions of what's going on. So I think that's at least the idea of the names and our relationships to them. I'm pointing out the kind of the dynamic of legibility of it, how legible is it? I think that's a very interesting dynamic about it. Kind of points to human ignorance, as basically what it sounds like to me, ultimately. That's probably my last. And one last note that the kind of note about pain and suffering. I had a note here. I think we talked about this last week or 2 weeks ago. But really, the mark of the devout person is the one who can rejoice in their suffering, right? Kind of laugh at their despair, or I think that's no, but another way you can frame it is to rejoice in suffering. Which, by the way, Ramadan's coming up, and me and Javi were talking off the record about it. Fasting is done now secularly to like lose weight and all those healthy benefits, but ultimately for the devout and the observant, it's meant to be that pain of hunger and thirst is meant to signify our relationship to God, right? Our needing of subsistence from God, things like that. So I just thought I'd note related to that. So with those two notes, I'm definitely going to need to bow out, but it's been a really great conversation, and looking forward to next week. Thanks, guys.
See you, Thomas.
I think what Thomas said about legibility, it helps me rethink about revealed when I was talking about that how things get revealed to us. So it is the name or the mark that is there. And it then depends that, and that's why God then transmutes and chooses to reveal himself. It's also on us that what form that are we ready to receive. About this pain and suffering and joy, I just rethought more. This here and now discussion again becomes very interesting because in the here now is always there, and in the now there is here. So now when we are talking about people who are rejoicing their own suffering, it's not just about a certain kind of sadism which is over there, meso-sadism. One can have that kind of reading also, but I think it's also more than that, because the moment you see God is all wrathful. Just a personal example. There are some people who are in my life, and I don't find them cribbing and all of it. It doesn't matter to them whether God is all wrath or God is all mercy, because in the wrath they see mercy also, and in the mercy they see wrath also. And then which takes us to the point of reality being frozen, which is then about it is like that. It's about you accepting it. And I mean, this is something that is that's very much there in our culture, which is like, I was like grown up being told that when you get something that you want, be happy. But when you don't get something, when you don't get what you wanted, be doubly happy, because maybe there is some other plan that God has for you. I can also see people in their relationship with suffering. Personally also, whenever I suffer, it's not always like mourning and mourning. There is a stability and quiet also in suffering, and there is a different kind of joy also in suffering. And I think what Chetan was saying, it gives you a passage not just to relate to other but to the world. And there are knowledges. I mean, why would Rumi say that wound is from where the light enters? Because there are knowledges that come from there. So going to here and now, there is joy in, but I don't want to say it because it appears too tautological, that there is joy in suffering and there is suffering in joy. But yes, I think there is a sense which then to me relates to the aspect of being revealed, what you choose to see, and the fact that reality is there, it's out there in the same form, it will remain there. But in what form you choose to see it. Yes, Chetan.
Yeah, I think what we're getting at actually is this discussion between, um, you know, uh, one on one end we have this problem of reality, and the other hand we have the problem of movement in some senses. If you think about it, that there is a reality which can be affirmed in everything, and then and that reality cannot come to you without this. And Thomas is not here, but his point about literal meaning versus figurative meaning actually is the same problem in some senses, and it's been known to us for centuries, where the struggle with actually understanding figurative meaning is not its figurative meaning actually. The struggle with understanding figurative meaning is a literal meaning. That how does a human being actually form literal meaning out of what he's reading? We all form figurative meanings all the time. We all are connecting one thing to the other. The problem actually essentially is that how do you form literal meaning? When you reverse that problem, you think about, oh, this is deeper than what we normally we think. Oh, language is already giving to us certain reality, and then we are creating others in some senses. That is our very usual theory making about metaphors and so on and so forth. That there is a meaning of a word that we assume to be true, and then there are other meanings which we can create out of them. If you think about this relationship, denotation and connotation that exist, and so on and so forth. Look, there are various ways to which Barthes and all these people thought about that problem. But actually, the problem is a reverse one in some senses. The problem is that how do you form a literal meaning? How do you form a meaning which is immediately given to you in some senses? And that becomes again a question of the reality. I think one thing can be said about this game between reality and dynamicism, which is that even if we that this idea of unity in some senses um, is not in the same space where where the multiplicity exists in that sense. It's not in the same horizon. We need to think about in what ways multiplicity already grounds this unity, and this unity already grounds the multiplicity. If you have to assume the unity over there, say Lacan wouldn't, Freud wouldn't. For Freud, the unity itself is a problem because it will always, and but as we say, even in Lacan and Freud, you get -1. You don't get a 1. You don't get a 0. What you get is again a -1. You get that one which is missing from that thing to make it complete whole. And you may think about that -1 as God if you want to, and so on and so forth. But I don't. That's not my point. My point actually is that how do we think about this idea of unity, this idea of frozen, reality, which 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 doesn't completely negate the multiplicity. In fact, it is a point of frozen unity in which multiplicity completely makes sense to you, in which the multiplicity is completely open to you. How do you form that relationship with unity? That's, I think, the challenge over here. That how do we form this relationship with unity in which multiplicity is completely open to us? And that is not an easy challenge. That slip always exists on both sides. I guess.
No, that's a good question, because most of the time it's us trying to solve the question of how do you explain unity and multiplicity together and stuff like that. But actually, what you're proposing is no. It's how do you have a relationship to multiplicity, to unity? If I'm understanding correctly, like for yourself, how do you make sense of that relationship for yourself? And then to maybe even broaden the scope bigger is like your question on suffering and pain. This would make the question the highest question, because if we can't relate to somebody that is suffering and going through troubles, then you could say that we fail to have some type of multiplicity relationship with unity. That this is what we need to realize and somehow have a relationship to, because then if we don't have it, then we don't have a relationship to anything. I mean, to something, but it's not really substantial of anything. I mean, especially we're talking about ethical and moral implications. So yeah, and I think this goes back to like the idea of what I always harp on, is that one, we have to become human beings. And I think to become human beings is to actually answer this exact question that you proposed, Don, is to have a relationship with the multiplicity and the unity for yourself. And then just to do like a side note on the literal and the figurative, I did not know that. I did not know that, but actually I've been listening to a lot of lectures by Schuon, and Schuon, he kind of throws a jab at Jung, because he's like, oh, Jung doesn't understand symbols. He's like the indigenous, when they talked about symbols were literal. He said symbols were literal. He said there is nothing that, and he hates Jung for this, because he's like, symbols were literal for them. He says when they saw something, thinking, perceiving was thinking. Perceiving was thinking. And, it's like, for me, that's fascinating, because then Schuon says, but for modern man now, the abstract is seeing. The abstract is seeing. So it's only in the abstract that I say that I can understand the world and see the world. And I've been loving his lectures, because it's really fascinating. I'm like, oh yeah, like, and how he claims this idea that actually, and I think actually this does kind of tie into the question that you're raising. Is he saying that we have lost our connection to the sacred? We have no relationship almost to the sacred anymore. That everything that we are doing is completely stripped of its metaphysical roots. And now it is just kind of like, what we have all this technology, all this problems with nature and so on, but back then nature was what it was because they had some type of sacred element to it. Everything had some type of sacred element, even the animals, everything had some type of sacred interpretation, and now there's none of that. And so I do feel like this question that you propose is a really important question. So with that, I'll pass it to Jyoti.
Well, yeah, that relationship to sacred is very important, which we don't have, and so one can see it in other relationships also. Even with God, we have a mechanical, technical relationship, and one can see it with others. In fact, once you can have a relationship with the suffering of the other, one also finds a relationship with the sacred. That also can be experienced. About this multiplicity and unity, I was thinking that, of course, it relates with the when Hegel is talking about salt. So there is salt, but when I was thinking of God, I could actually put salt over there and Hegel's example, because when he's talking of God, he's saying that there are two realities: the divine essence and the quality specific to itself that separates of or distinguishes from other divine names. That is how Hegel was talking about salt. So you need the whiteness, the tartness, the saltiness of salt, because that multiplicity there is a distinction. So the way, God fearing and all merciful, they all relate to God. There is a unity over there. Yet you need a distinction. If there is no distinction, how would you be able to give language or understand what does it mean to be all merciful? What does it mean to be God fearing? What does it mean to love? What does it mean to have wrath? How will you understand? The same kind of thing is conveyed when we are talking about any aspect. So you need multiplicity, the distinctions, because multiplicity allows us to grasp and grapple with the distinctions. And those distinctions become important to understand any object in a per se, the form in which it is there, the way in which reality is there, which might be fixed and frozen. But even in that fixed and frozen, there are those disparate aspects to it which appear disparate and distinct because it is important for them, but they all relate back also, connect back also. That's how I was trying to think through the unity and the multiplicity. Yeah, Chetan.
Actually, you are, right, Jyoti, in some senses, and Javier, that one of it, and you just read the passage that I also wanted to read in that sense, where my claim over here actually is that that Arabi is not struggling with this question that how are they both there. He's just asking you to accept it. He is not trying to give you philosophical treatise and giving you a way to say, which is what um, it's not that if we connect Lacan's -1 to God, there's something wrong about it. Only thing wrong about it is that activity itself. You're still trying to justify it in your own head in some senses. His problem is that don't play that game. Accept it that these two things are there. Once that acceptance happens, then something else can happen from there. That's the game you're playing with it. That's the game you are playing. The game is not simply about finding rational justification for, and you can find it. That's not the problem. The problem actually for him exactly is that minute you start finding it, there is something that is at stake in that activity which needs to be thought through. In that sense, the problem is not in that sense that, and how do we think through this form of orientation towards the world? That's essentially my question. That he's not asking you to, for instance, when he's giving you this kind of um, passage in some senses that um, you know every divine name signifies or denotes two realities, the divine essence and the quality specific to its or the separates or distinguishes it. He's giving you something which is very direct, which is something which is very very much there, and it is something which if you are open towards the world, you can immediately see it. And yet, and this is a very different way of approaching the problem, say, than what Hegel would approach in some senses. For Hegel, it is very important to develop what you're immediately seeing. It is very important to bring it to movement, bring it to bring it to surface, a scientific understanding, systematic development of something, so on and so forth. But is there a way of this to orientation towards this immediacy, which orients towards the movement differently than what Hegel is giving to us? These are open questions. I don't want to get into those kind of problems, but I think there is something here which we need to think about. There's clearly something over here. And if you look at the names, the problem of names is exactly that. That he's asking us to not get stuck into thinking about whether these names have a correct meaning, incorrect meaning, and so on and so forth. No, this binaries of, but essentially, as Jyoti was saying, this is a question of revelation for you. You either have it or you don't. How do you orient yourself? Uh, and you slowly develop yourself in that manner towards the world in which you are not and that is what Heidegger's in some sense problem also was with Hegel, that in Hegel there is something already presupposed about the outside, but if you have to be completely open towards the outside, what would that nature of that orientation be? What would the nature of that being be, which is not calculating the outside constantly, which which can allow the outside to mark it in some senses, you know. And that orientation, I think from Sufi thinking and rewritings like these, is an orientation which is not anxious about what the outside is bringing towards you, even if it's as painful as it can be, and so on and so forth. But that anxiety towards what the outside is bringing to you, you know, is settled through accepting what is coming up with, and accepting its particular reality completely, from which something else, you know, can.
Mm. That's
Can I ask him something, Javier? Yeah. If I go back to Javier and his example of him and his mother, then it seems that what you're saying, Chetan, Ibn al-Arabi is more closer to his mother, which is then is about deeds, about her actions. And while we are here trying to intellectualize it, trying to
No,
have
that would be again a different problem. The
okay,
problem actually is, I think Doris Lessing said in one of her lectures a long back, that a Sufi can be anybody. He can be a cobbler outside your road. He can be a beggar. He can be the king. He can be, you know, the worldly occupations do not. In that sense, a philosopher is no different from his mother in that sense. The problem is that we are trying to distinguish these two positions in that manner, that who's closer to the truth. The very distinction between two positions. If we are philosophers, it is our job to do philosophy. If we are social scientists, it's our job to do social scientists, and it can give us as legitimate a route towards knowledge as somebody else's job can give it to that person, isn't it? The problem is not that we should have a lesser claim on truth. The problem is that we need more. Isn't it? Of course, philosophy has a place in this world. Of course, all claims on knowledge has a place in this world. And of course, anybody who wants to actualize himself would actualize himself through some forms of knowledge. There will be some reading involved, there will be some thinking involved. All those things would be there, you know, and he would actualize it in his or her own context. And this does not mean every job is equal, or all social realities are equal for development. That is all. It also does not mean that. It just means that you cannot presuppose a social occupation to be a particular orientation to be higher than the other orientations. That presupposition, of course, fails. You can see that in many spaces. Javier, the other day, me and Jyoti went into a slum over there, and we met a man who's living in really tough conditions. He has a nala flowing out, single room house with 5 people living in that house. And what he does is he sits in his house and he writes on his copy Ram, 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 Ram. Ram is the name of God in the Indian tradition. And he has this picture of different gods kept in his room. And he's when he enters into his house, he starts giving us a proper theology lesson, upon and what is surprising is not how great his knowledge is. It may not be that great. What is surprising is that how that knowledge is helping him come to terms with the world that he is living in,
that's
and
true.
how that knowledge is playing a role in that space. So what is important for me at least was not, oh, let's see how great a philosopher this man is, or how what kind of, but in what ways is he able to orient himself towards his own world through bringing certain questions of knowledge which are completely absent in that space otherwise. Most men in those spaces are drinking, in drugs, in other things, and there is this old man who's who's trying to, how do we think through that? I think that's the Wittgensteinian problem in this in the,
mm. So yes, I think you're right. The Ibn Arabi's go ahead.
yeah. I just say one more thing. Jyoti, the way Vinadas portrayed it is that how do you not ascend from the everyday? The idea is not that there's an everyday and then you need to come above it. The idea is how to descend into the everyday. When you actually find that descent, you realize that every day is structured around this in very different ways. You have to really descend into it rather than ascend from it. Yeah, sorry, Javier. Sorry, yeah.
Oh, okay, so I think you were explaining. So Ibn Arabi is basically trying to say, you know, we can't make this superior distinctions about one is greater than the other, which ironically it actually makes me think of the Bhagavad Gita when I read it a long time ago, where it was like, oh, there's so many paths to God. There's the knowledge, the path to knowledge. There's the path to the love. Love one was the fastest one. I remember reading, actually. And then there's the deeds. But what was fascinating to me was like it said, knowledge is the hardest one. Knowledge is the one that is the most difficult path to go to. And and I'll never forget, because I when I was getting into Buddhism as well, I'll never forget a guy said to me, he said, "Oh, you must be one of those that are on the path to knowledge." And I was like, "Oh man, I'm screwed. I'm so screwed if that's if that's the case, because it's gonna take me a long time to realize what I need to realize." But anyways, that's like a side note is that in reality, these paths, they are the same. But I think this goes back to some of the earlier passages in the beginning where it was talking about that everybody has their station. And in that sense, we're equal. We all have our stations. The whole point is, how do I realize the station that I'm at, and how do I go to the next station? And this is the part that I like about Ibn Arabi, because it's almost like if you keep asking these questions, if you keep asking the questions that we keep asking in modern times, then it's almost like he's saying, if you do that, that's fine, but you're not also doing anything. You're still stuck at the same station. And in some sense, it's like it's asking you to accept the station that you're in order to go to the next station. So that way, maybe actually, if you go to the next station, you can answer the problem. Because it reminds me of like there's this ontological condition that you have to meet in order to answer the question that you want to answer. It's like I think about like a little child asking like, "Mom, what's sex?" Oh, that's fine. I mean, I can answer the question for you, but you're not gonna know until you it would be silly as a boy to just ask that question all the time and think about it, contemplate about it the whole time. And so finally you're old enough and you have sex and you're like, oh, okay, I have some knowledge about what that is. And so I feel like Ibn Arabi is kind of doing that, because from the beginning he talked about wujud is finding, it's about experiencing, it's about tasting. So this idea that we get stuck on like the questions of unity and multiplicity, he's like, it's almost like he's saying, yeah, that's fine if you want to do that, but you have to experience unity and multiplicity, whatever that means. And maybe I don't know what that means, but it engages a certain activity about what I need to not only speculate what that means, but I need to start experiencing actually what that means, which is an entirely different relationship that I think most people don't have. Most people do not have. You talk about unity, they'll be like, okay, I'll give you an argument to totally destroy unity. That's fine. But you're still not having a relationship to whatever. You don't even know what type of relationship you're having at that point. If there's multiplicity, that's fine. But it's like, I don't know. I've been watching Uncle Vanya, the play, one of the old plays, Uncle Vanya from Chekhov. And I started laughing because one of the guys like, what are we going to do today? We do the same thing: eat, sleep, work, whatever. That's it. So if I feel like when there's no unity, like that's exactly what it comes down to. Yeah, we're just going to sleep, eat, and I'm in suffering, but we can't do anything about it anymore because I'm old and it's gone. But I'm gonna pass it to GOT.
Yeah, well, I mean, that station thing was important, so I'm gonna think more about it. I was just thinking, and while reading this text, one of the experience that I had was it's all written in English, which one can understand, okay, but still one doesn't understand. But what is it that he's saying over here? So how we have, I mean, it's on a completely different note, but how these knowledges are completely missing, and I found myself quite incapacitated because I realized that those knowledges, those names, those ideas are not there to understand something like this. So for instance, on page 37, and I, because I had to read it like 5 times to understand, and yet I don't know if I understood it. So there is something that Abu Yazid heard a Quran reciter, and then he said, and then how strange, where will who is sitting with him be mustered? Now he goes on to say, when it came around to our time, I was asked about that. I replied, right? So we have Abu Yazid, then we have Ibn al-Arabi, then we are getting this from William Chitnick, and now here I am sitting in India, understanding it, whatever little knowledge I have, I was, it's okay, I mean, one can be fine about it, but there is a certain kind of mutation that has happened in the ideas, and I doubt if I really got the essence of it, because there is a limitation of the concepts, experiences, ideas, knowledges with which one is able to understand something like that. So this was one of the emotion that I was struggling with, which I thought I will bring on board.
Jyoti, Zizek has a wonderful answer to this, and I completely agree with him. He says when you read these old texts and you think that you're so distant from them, and they had the original meaning, and you are struggling to get that. His point is, how do you know that what meaning you have is not the original and they do? Maybe that distance is exactly what is required to understand the text. How do you know it's not? How do you think that they had the original one and now you are? A lot of texts is pointing that a lot of texts only reveal themselves to you when you read them from a certain distance, when they're read 1,000 years later, and then the meaning comes alive. What you're reading before was all wrong and stuff like that. So again, the point is not that we get the original meaning. The point is that we completely affirm the meaning that is being given to us. you know and there is a meaning given to it. There is a way to interpret this text into our own world, which is why we are able to do this activity every week for 2 hours and so on and so forth. The point is, how do you? Now, I remember Wittgenstein saying this: do not apply the rules of science to understand religion. You will understand neither. If you want to go and understand religion, go and understand it on its own terms. If you want to go do science on its own terms. Nothing wrong with both these activities. But when you start playing that, it is in that sense that you need to remove this anxiety. um,
I think the anxiety comes from the gut, there is a gut feeling. Like, I know I did not get it. I know there is something more. There is something else as well.
See, I agree with
So,
you. Point is that you did not get it. Is fine. You will get it if you read more and so on and so forth. Point is to associate your not getting it to something outside of yourself in your context would make your ability to get it that much more difficult for you. The point is to have that acceptance in that sense. To simply say, yes, I'm reading it, we'll see where it goes, and you will also get it within your own context. You'll be able to interpret it within your own context. There is no complete meaning over there in that sense, outside of that game we are playing. And that's a difficult thing to do. It's very difficult because you always second guessing yourself. You're always thinking there's something I need to know which is out there with which my knowledge will be complete. There's always that instinct in us with all kinds of I think systems. But exactly the question actually is that to completely affirm the fact that there is no knowledge out there, which is going to complete this for myself. Um, the knowledge actually is to be completely open to this itself.
But I think to keep like to add on, it's like actually you not getting it is like if we move back, it's actually your relationship with uncertainty. It's your relationship with not understanding that it's almost like once you have I don't know, maybe a certain relationship with uncertainty, that ironically you start understanding the text. And I feel like that's kind of like how it ironically works. And it reminds me of Schuon when he says, it's just like Wittgenstein here. He says, religion by itself is empty. He said that, like, just played by. He's like, religion by itself is empty. You need the sacred. And it goes back to what you said before, GOT, about mechanisms can be so empty, and that's exactly what a lot of religion is today. Is that, my mother would say, "Oh, you need to pray," and I'd be like, "Okay, fine," but in my heart, I was not there. I was never there. And so in that sense, it was always empty, and I never really believed in anything. So if you want to continue, Chitan.
I was just saying, if you think about the problem of revelation, exactly this. Revelation is exactly this point at which we stop calculating the outside. Revelation happens to you when you completely accept the contours that are given to you, and you realize that something new appears to you at that moment. There is a complete repetition at which something new happens. And what we essentially do is we keep on trying to calculate what is going to come to us, and we block what has to happen for that movement to take forward. As you rightly said, a child, if he keep constantly starts thinking about sex, he become more distant from sex. He'll not get that answer. There's something about that problem, that when you start thinking about, oh, I need to understand sex, there's something about that I don't know, and now I need to understand it. And there's something in that activity itself which takes him away from it. If he just lets it be, probably he'll get it. He'll get it much faster in some senses. But what is that state of letting it be? It's not simply any state of letting it be. There is a particular orientation over there, which you may call revelation, you may call revealed knowledge, you may call whatever knowledge, words you want to use for it. But there is something about you know that orientation, and that is there in Freud also. Actually, Freud actually got that problem to some degree. Freud saw that anxiety happens to you as a last resort feature in relationship to your conscious and unconscious, in that sense. When your unconscious cannot express in any other way, it needs anxiety. It's almost like taking out the steam. If you can't allow the life of your emotion to be complete, if you don't allow yourself to feel something completely, which involves an orientation towards pain, because your ego will always experience pain with what is coming from the unconscious, isn't it? And that is why the pleasure principle gets activated and the pain gets pushed back, and you don't want it to be experienced. But if you are allowing your unconscious to be experienced within yourself, your ego has to absorb pain to some degree. But what you actually what you actually get out of it is this relationship towards the world in which you are delaying the anxiety. Anxiety is always there. You always need that place from which steam can be taken out, but you're able to delay it, and you're allowing things to have that life.
Yeah, it actually, the whole story reminds me of the book of Jacob. Where they're all trying to explain to Jacob why he's suffering, and then Jacob saying, "I know why I'm suffering. It's because God must think I did something wrong. But let me make my case. Let me make my case." And they're all trying to explain rather than assimilate exactly what they don't understand. And so that's the funny part about the story, is that God will say in the end that all of you were wrong. All of you were wrong. All of you were wrong. And and I think this aspect that Chitan is capitalizing on is that it's not only about uh, explaining the or understanding, but there is this aspect of, before I try to understand, I have to assimilate, absorb the very thing in front of me. And I feel like that's something that not even I completely understand. What does it mean to really like assimilate something without actually understanding it first? So in that sense, I suffer the same way, Jyoti.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. When we don't give space for this unconscious, for these emotions, and this is related with what Javier is talking about, uncertainty. When we are okay with the fact of something which is uncertain, and be fine about it and accepting it the way it is, then those are also the doors to knowledges that can come. Um, but when I use the word that there is a certain kind of mutation, what I meant, yes, there might be an anxiety with grappling the original meaning. But what I'm also trying to bring to notice over here is this fact of these knowledges being missing from these knowledges not being around us. The kind of education, the kind of socialization that we all get, all these ideas, knowledges, they all are becoming, despite being precious, there is an incomprehensibility around it. And it's amazing that how it doesn't bother us. How when we send our children to schools, when we educate them, when they are in the playgrounds, how we don't find all these things around. Had they been around, this particular book, in any book, it would have helped them to understand the contemporary. And that is what a book is supposed to do. That is what any knowledge is supposed to do. It's not about getting the original meaning, but can I develop a better response to my existence today? Can it do that? But I find that missing, and that is something that really bothers me. And I don't understand, how did we reach here? The fact that there is a complete opacity, we don't even acknowledge it. This is I mean, in my classes, something like a very simple idea, I find it so difficult to convey it to my students. The fact that relationships are getting mechanical, even something as simple as that. So there is I mean, going back to the text, the relationship with the sacred, if we are the ones between God and cosmos, and why is he affirming on the fact that in this relationship to knowledge we are very much there, which we wouldn't be there in the relationship to power. So how do I understand an object, this entire subject object distinction? The fact that we are very much there whenever we are trying to understand an object, which can be anything, which can be a chemical reaction, which can be a human being, which can be anything. But um, how those sensibilities are missing. Yeah.
I take your point, Jyoti. That is a different. I think you're right. It's a different question than what I was sort of addressing, and I guess all social organizations go through its own dark phases in terms of we get something to lose something, and you lose something to. You're going through a time in which human beings are actually, as Javier was saying, human beings are mediated, are sort of connected only through the abstract in some sense, and that's what Hegel's problem also was, that in what ways does you know did we get taken over by this abstract in that sense, that we do not have any way to concretize what we actually know. And, that idea that movement of the spirit itself has lost its depth and it's broadened out, and that kind of a thinking which we need to think about. Yeah, Javier, I guess you've been like here for 2 hours 20 minutes now. If you're tired, we can we can end early also.
No, I enjoy talking. I
You
enjoy
enjoy.
this.
Oh,
Actually, new people coming in has given me more energy.
okay.
Because what Jyoti said, that really, I mean, that's something that I really feel like in the core of my soul, that actually the point of knowledge, and I hopefully I will link the video to you guys in an email, is that the guy that wrote this book, Chittick, he does, I just watched a lecture on him about learning, and he does this lovely comparison between Confucianism and Sufism. And he says, actually, the point of learning was to understand your existence, to and it was a relationship to the heart. And somehow we completely have lost that. Like it's like I go to school and they say, today we'll learn biology, yada, yada. I don't care because for me, it just has, I'm not going to use it, but I have a relationship to it. And then also this idea of like, I also feel like the idea of stories are like kind of lost. Like, for example, I always like to make this case of, you don't have to believe in the devil, but you can sap something from the mythology of the devil. And what can we sap from the mythology of the devil is that the devil did exactly this. He said that he's found a distinction between him and man when God made him. And that he instantly also said, why do I have to bow down when I am superior to him? When I am made of fire and he's made of clay. So you can see how this is kind of circling on what Ibn Arabi is saying, that you're presupposing something that is not true in terms of superiority or lesser or so on. And that the moment we start making these distinctions, it shows that why are we making distinctions rather than just accepting? You know, which is something that I think would be very hard to teach a child. You know, he's like, Mom, what is sex? Well, I can tell you, but you're going to have to accept that also you're not going to understand. You know, that whatever I'm explaining to you is actually never going to be close to your experience of what you're going to experience, and so on. And so there's always going to be this level of a relationship of I can explain it to you, but there's this aspect of that you won't understand until you experience it yourself. And even then, it's still going to be different for everybody else, and what they understand and what they mean by when they talk about sex and so on. And so there's this aspect of assimilation and absorbing that is no longer connected to the heart. It's no longer connected to the heart. And knowledge is just collecting information. And then the teacher tells me, okay, what did you learn? Well, I didn't really learn anything. I learned how to recall information. Because the moment I get out of your class, I promise you, I will throw that stuff away. So this relationship to the heart. And it's funny because I think Freud, when he talks about transference, it shows how close knowledge and love is. And how knowledge and the heart is. And that maybe if we would reestablish this in a new way, the heart and knowing, that we wouldn't have these problems of projection. Because actually, I think some of the aspects of projection and transfers is because knowledge is, we've severed that cord. Actually, I want to say we've severed that cord. We started severing that cord a long time ago. And now kids, yeah, they want to learn, but now you see how close knowledge is to the heart. So with that, I end my speech.
So there is this Professor V. Sanel, and he's in IIT Delhi, which is like a premier institution in India heavier. And you resonate with him. And there is a very interesting lecture that he gave. He's a brilliant guy, and he was talking about that there are two ways in which we develop knowledge and we develop understanding. One is in relationship to the world, and one is without being in relationship to the world. In social sciences, there is always this pressure that social sciences cannot move forward without developing a relationship with the world, but yet we cannot understand in social sciences. But how one is always pushed to go in social sciences by breaking this umbilical cord. You need not have a relationship with the world. And in my methods classes, students like constantly ask this question, can I bring I, in my project report, can I write like I felt it, and there are teachers who don't like it because you need not be there. But interestingly, he finishes the argument by talking about knowledge and power, and by drawing from Foucault and other people, that when we look at this modernity, Frankfurt School, this iron cage of modernity, and when reason has slipped into rationality, and he traces it back to this relationship to the world, that there has to be a language of love. And in India, in India, when we have this big divide of Brahmanical hegemony, which has been there on knowledges, one thing is there, that it has always been very dry. It doesn't have the it doesn't transpire itself through love. And then you have contrary ideas to it, which then affirm the fact that there needs to be love also whenever we are talking about knowledges. And yes, how those ideas are completely missing. So I found you completely resonating with what he was talking about. Yeah, Chetan.
I would just say that having a child actually is much more smarter. A child knows that when he's asking you about something, whatever explanation you give to him, he'll be okay and he'll go back and start playing. He just needs to hear some story about it. Which is why no matter how absurd a thing we say to a child always learns. Mothers say all kinds of things to the child. When a child comes and asks an uncomfortable question, you create all kinds of stories. But the problem with the stories is not that the child gets crippled and he doesn't learn anymore and he gets all. No. Any story told to him with love works for him. It doesn't need to be accurate, doesn't need to be true. It just needs to be a story, which is told with love and which is told with. And a child will be satisfied. He
So
will not.
yesterday, my 7-year-old, he had been asking people, "What is a gay? What is a gay?" And I was amazed to know nobody was telling him what is a gay. So he was like, "Mama, what is a gay?" So I said, "Some boys love girls, some boys love boys." And I thought he would be curious, he would ask me more, and I was ready. But he just played around and went away. So this is like what you were talking about.
Children are very strange, and even when they're asking questions, I was a very curious child. For example, I always wanted to ask you. When I was young, and my whole family was tired of me in many ways. That this guy will eat our head. But if I go back, I wasn't actually asking you because I wanted this accurate information about the world. No, I just wanted a new story. As a kid, I just wanted to hear another story. And my problem with adults was they didn't understand it. I'm just asking for a story. I'm not. I'm saying just give me any response, and then we play that game again. So, so that is how a child orients himself in herself in that sense, and that's something we really we underappreciate about children in that sense, that they have that capacity to simply accept what you're giving them as a form of stories, because of which they can activate something else in them, and so on and so forth. And something we need to be think about, because I personally think that as I'm growing old, I have developed strange relationships with my own identity, which are much more difficult to overcome for myself. Each time I learn something new, I think, oh, I'm too old to change myself now. Almost that feeling of tiredness sort of comes along. And you realize, oh, it has no meaning as such. It's not supposed to be, but it's a genuine instinct that arises in you, that you start thinking yourself as old, especially with post pandemic, and you realize that getting old has something to do with this also. This side of yours, where you feel a certain tiredness to change yourself, not because you don't know better, but simply because you think it's too late.
I was experiencing this like just the other day, because I was been listening to Shuan and all these guys, and I'm like, yeah, these are the ideas that I want. I want to die with these ideas, because I'm just getting tired of all this other stuff that people keep proposing. And actually, I like these ideas. So, but then I started laughing at myself, because I said, wow, I'm going to turn into that guy that says that I can no longer change. I started laughing, and then But but this aspect of death, I mean, it's really significant because even the body, I would say that we already start experiencing the process of dying with our own ideas, because the body starts rigidifying. It starts becoming solid and stiff. And I notice that as I get older, it gets a little bit more difficult to sway me from my ideas. It gets a little bit, and I'm almost becoming less charitable. Like I don't, because I'm like, no, I've been through this game before. I'm not going to play a game again. So I always think that that's an interesting aspect, and I start understanding my mother in this way when my mom said, because I was very interested in religions, and I read from Buddhism, Hinduism, all this stuff, and I'd be like, Mom, don't you want to know? She's like, No, I don't want to know. I'm too tired. It's done. Like, it's done. That's it. I don't care.
But don't you think both of you resonate when you say that we cannot change and it's fine? You actually resonate Ibn al-Arabi when he's saying that it is impossible for the realities to change. So there is a permanence over there, and within that permanence, yeah, some kind of dynamism would also be there. But aren't there parallels?
Because it goes back to the form, right? It goes back to the mark that you originally recognized it, which was the interesting to
Yeah, we
think.
go back to the mark in which God reveals to a human being. But with that, he also ends this passage by affirming the fact that reality remains the same. It doesn't change.
Totally. At least in my experience, what I am talking about myself in that sense, it's not uh, the very. We have to understand this word sameness in a new light. The problem with me, especially, is when I'm saying that it's very difficult for me to accept something new, is not that I don't change. It's in fact the reverse of the problem, that I change too much, and that makes me repeat my old self. The problem is not me changing. The problem is me radically accepting where I am. That from where something radically new will emerge. And that is what he's when you have to when you have to think this problem of sameness and newness in some senses. What we need to when he's saying reality remains the same, what comes across it, that there is a very close link between what is same and what is new. And unless we are able to think through that link very seriously, we won't understand. We may think on surface, oh, we are changing, we are learning something new every day. I know I read 100 pages, 50 pages each day, and I think, oh, this is making me change. But those kind, there is a form of newness which will make you repeat your old self, and there is a form of repetition which will give you something new. And how do you think through these two things? uh, and that is, I think, what he means when reality remains the same, that there is a form of repetition which will give you something radically new.
Yeah, that's something that I've been realizing too, is that I used to be against like habits, like a certain like specific habits. But then I realized that there's certain habits that are good, that if you keep doing, you get something new. You get something new at it. So this idea of repetition, you get something new. But then this idea of me always changing, like you're talking about, is that actually you always changing is that everybody's gonna say that, oh, that's the same Chitan, because he's always changing. He's always the same in that sense because he's always changing. And actually, my friends have told me this before. They said, so what religion will you find today? They already know that there's some consistency that from which I change. And they already know that I'm going to go from another religion to another religion to another religion, and even go back to another way, and they just know. And so in that sense, I don't know, I no longer change. automatically I've stopped changing in their eyes. Uh, and so in this sense, you're right, that actually there is almost nothing new, and that is what's, I don't know if I want to say almost frightening. That there's nothing new, because I'm always changing. Uh, but I don't know how to think through that actually right now. It's a big question. I don't know. And it almost makes me think about this idea of even like technological boom, how everything's changing so fast, that actually things are changing so fast that really nothing is changing. You could make that argument, right? From what you're proposing is that with technology evolving so fast that we're like, oh yes, change. There's so much change. We're progressing, but actually there's been no progression at all. And that we've come into this situation where we hate repetition and tradition. But this is why I've been listening to Shuan, because Shuan says tradition is something that is not within the cultural thing, is that there is a primordial tradition. And I think it's exactly what Chiton is talking about. It's a kind of repetition that allows something genuinely new to emerge. And I think that's the type of tradition that I'm interested in looking at, because other than that, then we do have this problem of we're constantly changing, but then in reality, nothing is changing.
Yeah, that's true. Um, I have to like think about, Chetan, what you're talking about. In my experience, is difficult, but yes, there is an exhaustion. I think that are pathological. The fact that we all are becoming, there is a pathology around. But I think what stands for today's times is the larger exhaustion. Something which I also experience. One is constantly exhausted. I mean, I can understand this change thing. For instance, so Javier, you're sounding a lot like Socrates. For Socrates, I can't be what I was yesterday. And it's amazing, like on Facebook, we have this 10-year challenge, and we celebrate it. I look same. And for me, there is nothing more ugly than that. Not just looking, I mean, even in terms of perceiving, understanding. How can you be same? How can you be what you were 10 years back? And there is a infantilization, we celebrate being infantilized. And I see around, I mean, I see adults around. I mean, I see my mom, who is like what, 65, but her emotional level I find at the level of 15. I realized that she just couldn't grow up after a point. How do you face the situation? And we forgot that it was important for all of us. And I guess over here, texts like this and these knowledges, these reading groups come to us because they help us develop a response to the contemporary, response to what comes our way. Yeah.
Just to say on the question of habit, I was reading this. Normally, if you read literature on habit, habits come to you as seats of power and so on and so forth. In fact, this problem of change, what Habit is talking about, technology and stuff, Marx's problem of capital is exactly that. That capital can instill certain changes through which it repeats itself, which is how capital can find its location in all societies. So more technology is bringing new stuff. The relationships of capital are repeating themselves. That is what Marx's problem was. That there is a form of repetition which is possible when you're making these new goods, new technologies, and new, so on and so forth. In some senses, so Marx saw that as a problem of capital in many ways. And but if you think about habits are generally seen seats of power. They're very you usually look at habits as habitus in, for example, in Bourdieu also comes across as this problem of capital, power, so on and so forth. I remember reading Veena Das, this anthropologist, the other day, and she said something very beautiful. She said, how do you think about habit in the sense that she goes to a slum and she's sitting over there, a woman with a very busy schedule, every day gives them tea, 4 or 5 of them. And by habit, she remembers which person will take more sugar, which person will take less sugar, which person will lead little hotter, little milder. How do you understand habit that can incorporate these levels of care within it? Those are also habits. Those are not simply, this idea of habit that we normally have, which is conservative idea of habit, which is, located with power, violence, and so on and so forth. Discipline, habit is located with discipline. That discipline demands habits, isn't it? But there are other forms of habit also. Habits actually are much more crucial to are able to incorporate our everyday world into spheres of love, care, understanding, emotion. How do we think through that aspect of habit? And it's not easy. For instance, a husband wakes up right next to his woman every day, and he touches her face or he touches her to see if she's sometimes happens that you wake up and you see, oh, she's there or not. That's also a form of habit. But
You do it with your child.
you do it to your child, a lot of mothers do that to
Is the
child.
child breathing or not? Is the child breathing or not?
Yes. I remember when I used to have like three, four dogs staying in my house, and every morning, just by habit, I would just go and search for her. Where is she? Where is she? Kalu kai, Kalu kai. Her name was Kalu. So I would say, where is Kalu? Where is Kalu? In that sense, how do you understand those habits? What are those? What is the relationship of those habits to you know our lives? Yeah.
Hmm. I'm thinking about, there's a story, this girl said that, she said, my mother, no matter if she's mad at my father or loves my father that day, she always brings him breakfast in the morning, no matter what. No matter if she hates him that day, no matter if they're not talking, she always brings him breakfast. So I think that's such a good point, Tom, because it's like, you could be mad at somebody, you could have whatever you currently feel towards somebody, but doing that habit, it actually, there's a certain kind of repetition that you're alluding to that actually would have the quality of care, that it would have the quality of mercy, regardless of how you actually feel in the moment of that person. It, uh, and it actually reminds me of when I was reading a little bit of Marcel Proust, when he talking about him as a child, saying that, oh, I just want to sleep with my mother tonight. I always want to sleep with in the bed with my mother, but my father never lets me sleep in the bed with my mother, until finally in the story the father says, yeah, go ahead, spend time with each other, because I know that boy is never going to change. And so he accepts it, and it's funny because it's actually the father comes to grips with that his son is attached to his mother, and that even though as many times as he's tried to put some type of discipline to separate the two, he's like, yeah, it's fine. He's always he's gonna be like this. He's gonna be like this. And so there's a part of us that have to accept that this may not change. And so in this respect, it's like an act of care. It's an act of care because there are certain things that repeat so much that we cannot change it. And so then the question results in, how do I have a relationship with something that no longer changes? And we could root this back to the idea of pain. When I'm always experiencing pain, how do I have a relationship with something that is never changing? And I think like the best people are, for example, like if I'm missing a leg, missing a leg is like, in order to have a relationship with that thing, is you go through invisible pains because you keep thinking it's there. And it isn't until someone shows you, it isn't until you finally look at your leg and you say, wow, it's not there, and you come to terms with it, that it's not there, that the repetition stops. And so I think in this case, Freud is very helpful when it comes to repetition, because there's something about us forgetting, and Jyoti kind of hinted at it, like if I forget, then the repetition continues, and in this case, nothing new occurs. So I found that fascinating.
I think that was brilliant. I have to leave. I'm sorry. I have my college at 9, so yeah, I don't have anything else. Yeah, Chetan.
Thanks. Yeah, I think we can end it here.
Okay, I'll end it there.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you guys for watching.